Thanks so much, Paolo. Presumably I can be heard. And thanks to Tom and Yadin and Elliot for actually remembering me. I've been out of biomedical engineering since 2009 when I retired from my position as the Director of Partners, Biomedical Engineering for the Partners Healthcare System. And I've been Director for Biomedical Engineering at Mass General Hospital since around 91 and Associate Director back in the 80s. So I've been involved in biomedical and clinical engineering for many years. My life's work is really around patient safety, and since I was doing two jobs back then in 2009 when I left the biomed group because I was concentrating more on the simulation work and the patient safety work, but I always have a soft spot in my heart for the clinical engineering and biomedical engineering. We've got an awesome team at the MGH. We're really fortunate about that. So even though I've been out of it, I'm glad I was asked to come back. It's a really great opportunity to talk to you about something that really I thought was the most important thing of all the things I was involved in, and I think that really made the difference. And it has to do with the partnering between clinical engineers, biomedical engineers, and clinicians. And my premise is that the best healthcare technology management comes from a deep understanding of clinical needs. You've got to understand what the clinicians need. It plays right into what Shauna was saying about what are you trying to achieve. That's the critical question. And the partnering between CEs and clinicians is needed. In our case, we were fortunate to be able to embed clinicians into the clinical engineering biomed organization. And I think when you can do that, it really has added value. It develops close ties and relationships so the engineers and the BMETs learn more about how clinicians work and what they need. So the next slide, please. So I'm going to tell a few stories. First, a little bit about how I got into this business. And again, I had kind of at least 2 or 3 careers. One of them is around the technology aspect of where I started out, and then I moved more into the patient safety realm and studying human error back in the 70s. I got to Mass General in 1972, so this is my 48th year, I think. But back in 78, we actually published on this, what was probably one of the first microprocessor-based medical instruments, the Boston Anesthesia system. And what you see around in the middle there is a team of the engineers, and Ron Neubauer, with the tie, is actually a physicist, MIT, Harvard-trained PhD. Jeff Moore on the right was electrical engineer, Josh Tolkoff, mechanical engineer, and that's me, if you can recognize me with the hair and the glasses and the mustache to the left of the display. But the critical people, oh, and down on the lower right corner, Ed Troutman, a MIT-trained engineer, who was just really pivotal to this. He was the one who brought this, hey, I've got this microprocessor. But what really gave us this idea was the clinicians we worked with. And on the your upper left is Rennie Meyer, looking very differently about 50 years ago, who was a fellow. He was doing his 3rd-year fellowship, and I spent in anesthesia. So I spent a lot of time in the operating with him. And it was through his eyes that I came to really understand what were the issues with anesthesia machines in particular that needed work. And in the lower left-hand corner are 2 other anesthesiologists, Jim Phillip and Mark Mitchell, who were working within our group as fellows at the time. And together, we built this concept of an anesthesia machine that would prevent errors by using microprocessor-based technology to get the various devices to talk to each other. Again, this is almost 50 years ago when this started. So anesthesia machines were much, much simpler, but this was really the first introduction to that concept of integrating the alarms and displays. It itself never used on humans, but it became the motivation for anesthesia machine companies to start to do this kind of work. And it came from this close collaboration between engineers and clinicians. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about a clinical engineer who I think was one of the great pioneers in clinical engineering. He really started the effort at MGH when Ron Neubauer and I were asked to put together a clinical engineering team for the anesthesia department and actually for the operating room. We found Jim, who was in upstate New York as a clinical engineer. Jim was just, to me, was the exemplar clinical engineer because he worked in the trenches side by side with clinicians. And even though he was, I'm not even sure he got his bachelor's, he really understood and worked to understand the medicine. So he could communicate with clinicians because he understood what they needed, what the clinical issues were. He didn't just respond to, oh, make this for me. He dug deeply to do that. And he was a fierce advocate for the clinicians and for change. It was because of Jim that Mass General stopped using ether in around 1981. Believe it or not, they were still using ether because they wanted people to have the experience in case they were in countries that still use ether, but it really was a dangerous thing to do. And Jim was the one who got that stopped. And he could only do that because he had the respect of the clinicians, because he understood what they did. He was the one that introduced the first electronically driven ventilator. We used to have these pneumatic ventilators with a hanging bellows, and when it disconnected, you would keep pumping away and the clinicians wouldn't notice it because the bellows would keep dropping and going back up. But the standing bellows ventilator, especially with electronic alarms, was a huge advantage in preventing accidental disconnections and the hypoxia and deaths that created. So Jim, to me, is the model clinical engineer. And then he partnered with somebody. In the next slide, Penny Ford-Carelton, ICU nurse educator. And Jim and Penny partnered closely, and I, with Penny, ran what we called the Device Utilization Committee. It was a true collaboration between biomed, clinical engineering, nursing leadership. We were truly multidisciplinary. The pharmacists, the materials management people were involved, and we introduced methodical technology evaluations. So it wasn't cursory. We'd do simulations. We would, before the days of simulation, we would set up the equipment, different vendors for people to come and look at, but we'd have them try it under as realistic as we could, not again with a full-scale simulator, but to really understand what were the clinical challenges. And there were clinicians back then that were intensely interested in accurate blood pressure measurement. It was a really big deal within the Mass General ICUs not to believe those numbers on the screen, because back then those numbers could be way off. And we had one clinician in particular named Dick Teplick, who was the head of one of the ICUs. He, Jim, Penny, we all partnered together to really make sure that we chose the technology that met the clinical need. And we were just driven, particularly because of this clinician who wanted those blood pressure measurements to be right. Jim and Penny went on, partnering also with this team, to convert from what were then reusable blood pressure transducers, if you can believe that, to standardize the entire hospital on the first disposable blood pressure transducers. And that only happened, again, by understanding deeply what the clinicians needed, how things work. Why don't we go to the next slide? Because I want to add now the physician component. So you got Jim Welch, the clinical engineer, Penny Ford, the ICU nurse educator, and Nat Sims, the physician, cardiac anesthesiologist, a superb clinician, but he was frustrated by technology. And he joined this team in our group, and they worked on several different projects, but one of the key things was this need they identified, that patients were in the ICU. If you had to be monitored, you had to be in an ICU. Again, this is decades ago, but the principles still apply. So what they developed, which is what's shown on the next slide, what was called flexible monitoring. And what that is, it was, forget the next slide, Shawna. So it was the concept of flexible monitoring to increase the safety and reduce the transfers that required just for monitoring. So it was to create a safe transport monitor that plugged into the monitoring system on the floor, and that it was so simple and easy to use that the floor nurses, who were never used to having monitors, could now just make that part of their daily lives. Actually, it was interesting. It was never really published in an academic journal, but there were publications to show that there really was no change in patient outcomes. And that's what you wanted, was to be able to move patients out of an ICU to a less acute area and continue to monitor them safely. And this happened only because of that partnership. And the engineering of this was absolutely critical. And again, the same kind of principles applies every time you're doing some kind of new innovation. I want to talk a little bit more about Nat in the next slide, because Nat went beyond this. And again, Nat was a part of our engineering group. He retired from clinical work probably around over 20 years ago. He's still a little bit active, not clinically. But if you use a infusion pump, a smart infusion pump, that's the guy who invented it. And he did it in our engineering lab. And this came out, and again, as this collaboration of having a clinician who was in an engineering group and had access to the engineers, not just in the engineering group, but also out in industry, to think through this concept. And it may sound simple in retrospect. Geez, you just it's a computer now, just put a library of drugs in it. It is anything but simple. All of the kinds of issues associated with that. And even today, as smart as those pumps are, as you know, they're not foolproof. But Nat is that clinician innovator who, embedded in the engineering group, was able to do marvelous things. But one of the things we have, still have, is a model shop, and he was able to use that model shop with engineering people to develop things like what you see on the right, which was affectionately called the Nat rack. And it's a rack that would hold all these pumps. And the way the beds were configured was you could move a patient from the bed to the stretcher or to another bed, and there's a motor on that rack that lifts up the pumps, and then you can move it over and set it back down on the other bed. So this is an innovation by a clinician working closely with the engineers in the engineering group. Why don't we go to the next slide? So let's talk about the barriers briefly, because this is not easy to do. I was running the biomed group, and I was always kind of having to do cover for all the things that we were doing, because a lot of it was really innovative. But you really have to get beyond the barriers. And I think one of them is the intimidation. And Jim is a great example of not being intimidated. Don't be intimidated by the medicine. No, you don't have to become a physician. And the physicians don't have to understand as much about engineering as you have to understand about the medicine, the physiology. Don't be intimidated by it. The intimidation is self-inflicted. You can learn about that. And the more training you had, like I did my master's of, anatomy and physiology in an animal lab, that gave me just enough that I could be conversant. I could have a dialogue. I knew enough to be dangerous, if you will, but to ask good, stupid questions. The interests are different. Getting clinicians to partner when they're really clinical, and as I say a little bit further, they don't have the time. It's really more challenging today because there's less of that kind of free time that clinicians have. And then there's this culture. Clinicians and engineers think differently. You've probably heard about this. You've been talked about it, but what does that really mean? That's probably several hours of conversation, but culture is a big barrier. The first way to get beyond it is to understand it, understand what the differences are and the barriers. And the other is money. I mean, how do we find money to pay clinicians to be in the anesthesia department? Well, I had developed a lot of cred with the administrators over the years because of the various things I had done, particularly associated with patient safety. So they trusted me. And I was able to use some department money in the biomed group to hire clinicians. There were other nurses involved. I don't have time to go into it. One of them ran the QA for our group. The other was the nurse educator who helped implement technology installations. So you can overcome those barriers, and the more respected you are by the leadership, the easier it is to do that, as you well know. The next slide. So again, just to remind you, I believe that clinical engineering partnership is good for patient safety and technology effectiveness. Profoundly good clinical engineering requires deep understanding of the needs. To be effective, being a true partner means going beyond the occasional consultations. You got to engage with, listen to, and support clinicians to be part of your team. And on the next slide, if you want some more bedtime stories, there's a memoir I have in this book called This Is No Humbug, Reminiscences from the Department of Anesthesia of the MGH. And it's on Kindle. I think we had to charge something. It's $2.99, so I made a Kindle version of it. So if you look at that chapter, a lot of stories like this about how all this came to be, and I'll stop there. And thanks for the opportunity to chat about this stuff. It's been a long time.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for your exciting talk, and also amazing.